My name's Nicole Van Tassell, and I have waited 7 years to be able to have this opportunity to still tell my story. And I'm really grateful for these two beautiful women next to me that have helped me on this journey. And I'm excited to be here. Thanks.
We weren't sure if we'd have an MC, so we're introducing ourselves. I'm Kristyn Decker, born and raised in fundamental polygamy. My dad was a leader for 18 years of my life while I was still in, and he started being an advocate and after I left and wrote my book, and I'm here to support Nicole's story because this is about her case study here.
Hi, I'm Jane Ridley, and I have never been in a cult, but I met Kristyn when I was doing my Masters in International Human Rights Law, and my thesis was entitled Human Rights Violations Within Religious Cults and How the US Legal System Fails to Protect Victims of Abuse. So we sort of met online because it's during the pandemic, and I conducted a series of interviews across many different cults, then focused on polygamy and Scientology as the two bases. So we've come here today to use Nicole's case as like a case study with Kristyn's background, and then I'll have some input in terms of the legal process and how it should and shouldn't look. But I should just preface this by saying, I used to be in the police in the UK, so I'm going to reference that a lot as a comparative study. So when you think, why is she doing this? There is a legitimate reason. Okay.
All right, well, I'm going to start and talk a little bit about my leaving, and just really briefly, because this is not about my story, but more about Nicole's. But being born and raised, my dad had 13 living wives, and then he was sealed to many other women. He had 23 biological children and adopted about that many more that came with the other wives that he married. I was the first wife and believed I had to live plural marriage. And so therefore I helped my husband groom another woman to marry, which was a cousin of mine, and she ended up marrying him. I started leaving. I think I left because I noticed, like my soul noticed the harms all along. My mother was very miserably happy, and she cried all the time. And then she'd say how happy she was living plural married. She taught me that that's what you're supposed to do, be miserably happy so you can get to heaven no matter what, suffer and endure. And basically I left before I physically left. I was done, but I had to figure out with all my children how I'm going to make ends meet and get out of there. So that was a process that was really awesome. And then I left and I wrote my book and found a whole bunch of other people who spoke to the harms of polygamy. And then I decided I needed to start doing something about it, get people to speak, and to really address these issues. So that's one of the things we're going to do, is I'm going to speak to the harms of polygamy, and then Nicole will tell some of her story, and like Jane said, we'll go from that area. But basically, I want people to know that coercive polygamy or religious polygamy is not about polyamory or choice or adult. It's very religiously based, and it's from the very beginning coercive. I grew up, and I'm also going to talk coming from my upbringing and from those all around me and the stories I've heard. So this doesn't fit everyone in every situation. I like to make that clear. But it is that we believed, for 6 generations of fundamentalists, from my dad clear up to 6th great grandfather, knew Joseph Smith, who's the founder of the LDS Church, and we believed in his 132nd section of the Doctrine and Covenants that says that women will give their husbands other wives or they will be destroyed. And that was the rule. And it was also called the New and Everlasting Covenant of Plural Marriage. So therefore, that's what we believed. And there were threats behind that consistently. I was afraid if I didn't get my husband another wife or 2 or 3, and 3 was the main thing, that I wouldn't have my children with me in heaven. And not only that, but Joseph Smith, there's records of him coercing other young girls and threatening them with hell if they didn't marry him and or another man he was assigning them to, and that he would save their families and them if they would marry him. So this is where the main Utah, Arizona fundamentalists, which is thousands, come from that basic background. The most of us were born into it. I still think that there's a lot of incest because of that. There are not a lot of converts. Nicole's story is she was converted, and the very few percentage that are converted also come in from my experiences and background and knowledge is from the LDS Church, because they too believed in Joseph Smith. And so that's how the AUB group that I was in would coerce them. This is what Joseph Smith said, and you need to do it, and you better do it or else. And so it's very, I think I'm going way over my time. I had 10 minutes. And I was like, we don't have a timer. I was hoping we had somebody. It's men will become gods. That was the doctrine, and they need all these pearl wives to do that. And women should be submissive, obey their husbands. They're the leaders. They follow the leader follows, which was my father, follows God. The men follow him, the women follow him, and children their moms. And this is the line of authority, and do it. You do this or else. Women, like I mentioned, are to help groom other women for their husbands. That's our job, because we know that if we don't get him other wives, we're not going to be saved. And so we're also supposed to bear as many children as our bodies could possibly bear. You will see in that example, Nicole's going to tell you how she fits into so many of these situations. The incest is horrific. There's so many birth defects and problems in that area. My father and my uncle, who was the previous leader before that, said that we were not to marry relatives. But in the end, my dad said, no, now the day has come when we have to marry relatives. So therefore, because there's not enough good men, there's not enough good women there. And so they've been intermarrying. There are GANs in the group I left. It's called GAN disease, giant anaxal neuropathy, I believe the word is. And the children don't have much of a chance of living past mid-teens. Very early on they pass through, and it's horrible. No way to, there's no treatment for it. As of now, they haven't found that. So I think Nicole is going to talk about her part here.
So to begin with, I need to preface that I am still legally married, even though I left 7 years ago and filed for divorce. So I'm going to be referring to him as Richard. And I'm a survivor of his criminally charged 6 felonies of domestic violence. And I still consider that my life is still in danger because he is scary. So I just want to tell you how I met him, because I was 15 when I met him and he was 23. And he portrayed himself as, I was 15, he was 23. He had portrayed himself as a returned missionary from the LDS Church, which he was, but he was also had a membership in the polygamy group, the AUB. So, you know, I'm from a little country town. I'm just a redneck girl. And when I met him, he was very charming, sophisticated, I thought. And for a little redneck girl, it was, you know, special to be having someone give me attention that was sophisticated and out of town. So despite all of the warning signs and against my parents' hard objection, I did marry him 2 weeks after I turned 18, and he was 25. And there were warning signs that I ignored. Now, I mean, I can see now he started isolating me, as soon as I met him. And I get from my family, he used words like, we're supposed to be married and your parents are fighting us because, God wants us to get married. And he used that and turned in my head at that young age that, oh, he cares for me, he's fighting for me. And it isolated me from my family. So when I married him, Kristyn's dad actually married us on June 20th in 1992. On June 27th, we actually had he called it a fake real marriage. And that's when I was legally married to him. And it was actually on my parents' 19th wedding anniversary. And he did that to punish my parents for trying to stop our marriage. And that was on the 27th of June. So I've been married to him for 31 years. And as soon as I had gotten married to him, his personality switched so fast. And like a week or two after we were married, I had asked him, please don't go to work, stay and cuddle. And he threw me against the wall and just said, I can't wait till you have a kid so you can smother it instead of me. That was devastating to me because I realized that I had no one to turn to. And as an 18-year-old girl, I felt like I couldn't go to my parents and tell them that they were right because I had too much pride. And as within 4 months, I was pregnant with my first child. And Richard had told his brothers that he was going to keep me barefoot and pregnant and going to get as many kids out of me as possible, to make it impossible for me to ever leave him. I realized that I was just an object to breed. I was chattel, and I had 15 kids in 19 years, and I have 13 living. I had a set of triplets and 2 didn't make it. In 2000, when I was pregnant with my 15th child, he told me that I was used up and that he was going to take a plural wife. And in 2012, polygamy was still a second-degree felony. But like a lot of people, excuse me, a lot of people in the AUB, it's really interesting. They say they live higher laws, and the lower laws, like of the land, don't apply to them. They just think they're untouchable. And at that time, polygamy was still a second-degree felony. February 6, 2016, I was at a meeting at the AUB. They have Sunday meetings in a big building. And actually, Kristyn's brother asked me to talk and to bear my testimony about plural marriage. I got up there. I had nothing to say. I didn't have a testimony in plural marriage. And the only thing I could say is I was grateful for my children. And at that point, I knew I had to leave. So I had started to plan to leave. My parents had hooked up with Tanya Toole from Holding Out Help, and that she's a nonprofit that helps men, women, and children escape polygamy. On April 10th, 2016, I got a text from a junior high friend. My oldest daughter was engaged. I had 50 people at my family, at my home, were celebrating her, getting engaged. I got a text from a junior high friend that had just said, congratulations, enjoy your day. And he picked up the phone and saw that I was talking to got a text from another man. And he just had a meltdown. He dragged me by my hair back to the bedroom. He called this person and said, who the F are you? And why the F are you talking to my wife? And he threatened to kill him and me. He threw me on the ground in the bedroom. My 3-year-old daughter at the time was on the bed sleeping. And he strangled me first with my hoodie strings and then with his hands. And he did it so hard that he broke my voice box. I don't have the same voice as I did before that. He also, during a 45-minute beating, was just on top of me, pounding me. And at one point during the beating, he opened the door and said to my other kids and the people that were in the house, do you want to see what a whore of a mother that you have? He also told me that I needed to slit my throat and disembowel myself. That's known as blood atonement. And in polygamous groups, blood atonement is the only way that you can repent to get to the celestial kingdom. That's a very real thing that Richard had taught to not only me, but to our children. And I realized then that I had to leave. The coercion and complete control that he had on me, my children, he ruled so much by fear and still does that it's scary. He is a very scary individual. At this time, he was friends with Cody Brown. We have sister wives, and Cody Brown had gotten a legal divorce, and he asked me for a legal divorce and to sign my parental rights over to this concubine. And I also had some property that was in my name, and he wanted me to sign the property over to the AUB. I was put under house arrest. I had people, my children, I couldn't go to the bathroom without being watched. And then he had a 4-hour meeting in his office. I had my daughter-in-law there, of course, the concubine, and they just went around for 4 hours telling me everything that I did wrong and trying to get me to admit that I had had an affair with this junior high friend. And at one point, my one daughter said, "Mom, just admit it. Please just admit it." And I wouldn't, because it didn't happen. You know, and as I look back, having my children have to tell things that were wrong to me has definitely impacted them, and the abuse that went through really changed my relationship with my kids after that 4-hour meeting. And Jane's going to talk about the laws and stuff, and why, you know, polygamy in Utah is still not charged or punished, or Utah turns a blind eye to it.
Okay, so like I said, I'm going to use the UK as like a comparative piece. So in 2015, the UK implemented new laws targeting control and coercive behaviour. This stemmed from years of unpunished domestic abuse and violence cases unable to reach the threshold to prosecute the perpetrator in court. And although we've got a long way to go in achieving a high success rate, the law is still relatively new and is at times acting as a deterrent for potential abusers. The 1994 Federal Violence Against Women Act in the US, for example, criminalizes only felony or misdemeanors crimes of violence in domestic contexts, which then negates Nicole's situation because it's seen as religious rather than domestic. But by criminalizing behaviors, we've seen a new law transform how society views acceptable power dynamics in relationships and how we tackle abuse. One-off incidents are rare. This is now understanding a pattern of behavior that is a war of attrition that wears a person down daily. There was a notable case in the UK. Sally Challam was previously jailed for murdering her husband, but this was later overturned after 8 years in prison due to the fact that Challam was suffering a psychological adjustment disorder, and the defence argued this was a result of decades of control and coercive behaviour by her husband. This was accepted by the courts, and there's a lesser plea of manslaughter was entered, meaning that it should be released from prison due to time already served. So it's a good example of, like, she did murder him, so she did do wrong, but there was extenuating circumstances behind the lead up of what actually happened with that one. So the 2015 law not only gives legal recourse to sufferers of psychological abuse, but also makes it easier to hold perpetrators of physical violence accountable by fundamentally changing the way authorities approach domestic abuse. I know from my own training and my own time in the UK police, we do a lot around, well, first of all, the UK model of policing is very victim-led. So it's a completely different realm to the US. So we look at the victim first and we talk to them, but we're trained in terms of recognizing this, even if they can't recognize it, so we can work slow and steady and literally do it as baby steps to ensure that they, first of all, are free and they can leave, but second of all, we can pursue a prosecution when it goes to CPS. So control and coercive behavior is as bad as physical abuse, if not worse. It's mentally scarring. It is harder to prove than physical assaults that leave physical things you can see, like wounds, bruises, or even hospitalization. But the law has arguably helped to give autonomy back to the victim, regardless of gender, because this is not gender specific to women, enabling police to investigate based on a report of control and coercive behavior. Control and coercive behavior can be found in the Serious Crime Act in 2015, creating the offence of controlling or coercive behavior in an intimate or family relationship. And in the UK, this can be tried summarily or an indictment has a maximum penalty of 5 years imprisonment, which again acts as a deterrent. And the more charities and local organisations sort of publish these statistics, you can see, and it does act as a deterrent, because each text message, each phone call, and even keeping a diary, even though people could lie in a diary, somehow it still holds up in court, which I do find bizarre, but it's helpful for the victim. So yeah, we're making progress. It's not perfect, but we're definitely getting there. As we know, and Kristyn's outlined, the control and coercive behaviour is a build-up over time, and often the victim doesn't realise what's happening until it's too late. Much like Nicole's example, she was besotted, she was essentially groomed, he was older, he took care of her, and then it quickly went downhill. On the charter for the 2015 law, there are 32 examples of the statutory guidance framework, but that list is not exhaustive. So that's 32 possible ways to control and coerce somebody. That's 32 ways to ruin a life, and that's 32 ways, and the list is growing. Like I said before, as the UK has a victim-led model of policing, we literally treat the victim first. We lead on their reports, what they want to do, and we guide them to the best option. We give them the options, but we do what they want, and that gives them the power back, especially in situations where it's like this, religious abuse, domestic abuse, whatever it may be. It kind of gives them some autonomy back that they've maybe lost. Having worked it, I do find it's more like humane and compassionate way of policing, and I definitely saw the benefits of that. And to be honest, it's a bizarre sentence, but from having that compassion, I even found myself like befriending known criminals due to the treatment as a human first, because they may have done something wrong in a completely different, they could have stolen something, but the circumstances why they've gone and committed theft really does sort of gives you a bit more of a holistic approach to who they are as a person. And even if they've gone to drugs and alcohol, it's like, but why have you gone to drugs and alcohol? So it really does help that. Don't get me wrong, the UK police are not perfect at all. However, but due to rigid policies and procedures, it's really hard to fail a victim. And if you do, there's the IOPC, which you can complain to. And it's quite easy to put a complaint in and have sort of some resolve from that, because everything is documented and it's kind of easy to see where you failed. And like if you compare this to the US, victims are not in a strong position. And I really love the US, like more than anyone realizes, but it pains me to critique it. However, the US, the legal system are failing victims of abuse, especially when it comes to like religion. And specifically in Utah, it's demonstrated multiple times in the case of Nicole, it does not always, if at all, recognize religious abuse as a crime. Religious abuse in the sense of the word concerns domestic abuse and violence, bigamy, tax fraud, to name a few. However, due to the religion aspect of it, Utah seemingly turns a blind eye to this, and many perpetrators go free without investigation. Nicole's case is a prime example of this, further exhausted by the pandemic, delaying an already lengthy divorce and custody battle. As we all know, the US Constitution was built on the notion of a secular society where one has the freedom to choose or to abstain from religion as that person sees fit. I'm going to go into a bit more detail later, but it's needless to say that Utah in particular flexes the First Amendment in favor of religion time and time again. More recently in 2020, they changed the polygamy law to that of an infraction, which is punishable up to $750 in a fine. That's it, it's same as like a parking fine. The bigamy amendments in 2020 took away the security blanket of controlled women in polygamous sex. Interestingly, they also use the word bigamy rather than polygamy, that provides a legal loophole for offenders, as polyamorous marriages are not legal marriages. The whole tenet of polygamy is based on coercion and threats of hell. At the end of the day, women's needs are not met, their voice is not heard, and yet again, the state of Utah has let another victim and another woman down. And that's why Nicole's here to tell her story today.
I'm going to talk for a minute about how hard it is to leave. And I've been involved with victims for about 12 years. So when I left, I wrote my book, then I got very involved with trying to help with victims and rescue those who wanted to leave. I was accused of kidnapping people and all that mean stuff. And I'm evil, if you didn't know that. Watch out for her. She's this wicked person. I've been accused of everything you can imagine: drugs, being mean and bitter and horrible and lying, and all this stuff. When you leave, you're thrown under the bus. That's just all there is to it. But I like the analogy of being raised in polygamy, in the cult of controlled polygamy or coercive polygamy, as being raised inside of a cage. Because from the time I was little, and everyone I know, we were told where, when, how, who, what. And yeah, it's okay because God gave us free agency. But if you choose anything but what we tell you, then you're wrong. You're safe in this cage. If you stay in this cage and do what we tell you to do, then you've got it made. But if for some reason you make me mad and I open the cage and throw you out, you're in hell. You're in instant hell. And if you decide to somehow escape there, you're in hell. Just stay in this cage where you're safe, where we'll tell you where all of these things and get you to heaven. So for Nicole, being coerced at a young age, it was similar to her. She didn't quite get that, but she grew up with other doctrines that supported what her Richard gave her and told her to do. Leaving is horrendous. I started leaving mentally before I physically got out of there. I had to go to school. I was planning how I'm going to raise my kids. How will I take care of myself? Had hardly any self-esteem. I got therapy because a judge told my daughter she had to. And so I got it. That was one of the best things that ever happened to me. But I had no money. I had very low self-esteem. I just had to reinvent myself. Instead of being who I was told I was raised in that cage, I had to find and discover who and what I could be. And it was really scary and adventurous. I looked at that. Thank goodness I had that wonderful therapist for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years. I was terrified, like everybody else, that I was going to go straight to hell. I'm leaving my dad, who's the prophet, all my family, all my siblings, everyone I knew that I'd grown up with. I had tons of kids. And this, I'm telling everybody's story, not just mine. This is most women in the polygamous cults, lots of kids. I had 7. And that's just maybe a little less than the average woman, average from the AUB, probably about 10 or 12 kids. I had no money of my own and no education other than just barely high school education. Job skills, very minimal. And what happens to a lot of people, and this is why they can throw people under the bus, because when they're thrown out of the cage or decide to escape, then they don't have any clue what it's like to be out of what we called in the world. A lot of the young boys that I worked with said to me, Kristyn, we were told we were going to hell and we were thrown out in hell. So we joined them. We did the drugs, we started the drinking, we started the illicit sex. We're joining them. We don't know anything else, nobody out there, And so that's what happens to a lot of people. They don't know and there's very few people to catch them, especially when I left. Their HOH wasn't there. And the women and the children are lost outside what to do now, where, when, what. When they leave, there's hostility, betrayal. We know this from every cult. Families will turn against you. I know of many cases. Right now in my head, I can think of 10 to 12 women who went through what Nicole's going through, losing their kids. The fundamentalists will pull their money. They will put all their assets in someone else's name. They will do anything possible to keep the kids away from the person who left and not pay child support or alimony or anything else. This is so common. And the judges won't look at this. They've been in, the women that I know have been in court for years and years and years and figuring out how to pay for it. There's not enough lawyers. There's just, and I have to say really quickly that there's 4 groups that help people that leave, Holding Out Help, and 2 others that are Christian, which have done more than they ever was for me when I left, which are, they're wonderful places. They're perfect places for helping. And there's one that's pro-polygamy that runs a group that gets most of Utah funds, literally most of any funding. They're run by people who support and live polygamy. And so the toughest part for me was working with people who've been spiritually abused and don't want to have anything to do with religion for a long time. And then they're put into these systems and or support groups where people require, ask them to follow these rules or these laws, or they feel uncomfortable around that environment. So a lot of the kids that I worked with, especially the young boys, just rebelled against that. The therapists don't know a lot about this kind of, I remember this when I left, I thought, this woman doesn't have a clue what I'm talking about. She's crazy. I don't remember, that's terrible, but I remember thinking that this woman's crazy. I'm like, you don't know this and this and this, because you think I'm raised in that cage. That's what I know. How come you don't know all that stuff? So it's like a complete different language. You're growing up with a different language. So basically, it's the parental alienation. It's horrible. Her ex is telling those kids how wicked and horrible she is. There's, I think I've covered most of this. I wanted to say really quickly. Oh, good for time. Okay, I'm always talking so fast. I could talk for days about all this stuff and stories, no end to the stories. Okay. So another thing that really was hurtful is that Utah's AG, Mark Shurtleff, for years and years, I talked to him. People on our board talked to him. There were women that would go and tell them about all these things that were going on and beg them to do something different. You've got to help. You've got to put a stop to these abuses, especially the sexual abuse. My brother said to me, quote, "There's not one AUB family that's not adversely affected by sexual abuse." And he's in it. He's still in with his plural wives. And so I'm telling him, we're all telling him about all these things that are going on. And then he would say in their general belief forever, as long as I can remember, is we're not going to prosecute polygamy or polygamous, I should say, but we will prosecute the crimes or the criminals or those who are doing that. Very, very, very rarely, hardly ever. And usually that's when they're publicly shamed, when that's happened, when somebody's called them out and it's a big to-do. Federal agents are doing more than the people in Utah have ever done there, and Arizona with other groups and other fundamentalists. I want to make it clear I'm not anti-polygamous. I've been called that 5,000. These are my family, my relatives, my loved ones. And it's just the harms that I see, that I've seen all my life, that I've personally been a victim of abuse. And that's what I'm against, is the harms of polygamy and the cult mentality and the coercion and the damnation and the threats and the, physical abuse, everything that happens. Mark Shurtleff, who said that again and again to us, defended Richard in court. He always said, if we have a victim, we'll prosecute, we'll do something about this. But he ended up being the one who defended. And I was sent to court. I'm forgetting the word, where I had to show up at court as a witness, and they deliver, what's the word I'm trying to think? A subpoena, thank you. I was subpoenaed twice and to go to testify about what about what I'm talking about, the harms of polygamy, especially in the AUB in this court case. And Mark Shurtleff said, we can't talk about polygamy. We will not bring it in because this is Utah. I mean, I'm just making that up, but I know that's why. And we won't bring up the polygamy issues here. So that on the stand, I was in there, she had to try not to say polygamy, try not to say plural wife. Her husband's got a concubine. That's what she, and I don't think you were even allowed to say that, which made her look like she was being deceitful because she's trying to explain what happened and with the other person. And when her husband takes us, and anyway, I was so angry. I could hardly speak about that. So this is a typical of some of the Utah things we've dealt with for 30, 40 years. Anyway, I think I've covered most of mine. Nicole will tell more about hers part.
Thanks, Kristyn. On July 11th in 2016, Richard came in and gave me an hour to pack. He said, you're not going to have any money. You're not going to have any food. There's not going to be water, no communication. He said, I'm taking you away until you repent. And in my mind, the only way I could repent was this blood atonement. And I thought that he was going to make me do it and I wouldn't be alive. So I texted Tanya Toole and told her, I got to go now. She said she was 35 minutes away. And as I was going through my home and looking at my children, it was really hard because I knew that once I left, I was going to be dead to them. And that was hard because I've spent 24 and a half years and made this home. I did. It was very beautiful and lots of garden areas and a sport court and a sand volleyball pit and a baseball diamond and gardens and vineyards. And in fact, Richard testified on the stand that it was the Garden of Eden. And but I am the one that had planted all the stuff. He didn't do anything in the yard, and of course the concubine didn't. So at that point, when I texted Tanya Toole, there was 2 Utah County sheriffs that came. I had my 3-year-old daughter and one bag, and Richard was working like 50 feet away from the front door. And she got there and my little 5-year-old son was on the porch, and I tried to grab him and he started fussing, and I had to leave him because I couldn't get him in the car. And that's one of the hardest memories that I have, is that I'm seeing my 5-year-old son on the porch and he's just looking at me like, why are you leaving? And the next day on July 12th is when I filed for divorce. I did get a protective order. A week later, I went back and got the other 8 minors. So I left and I had 9 minors. I am now down to 4. That's what I've got, 4 minors left that I'm still actively fighting for custody with. After that, when I got the minors, I went to a holding out help safe house. They have safe houses because of retaliation, because these people are violent. My older adult children and Richard found out where the safe house was. It wasn't safe. We had gone out of town, and when I got back, the screens on the windows had been altered and stuff, and the safe house actually had to put up a security system. My adult children would sit on the other side of the road from the safe house trying to entice the minors to come across to them. I have my oldest twin just about got hit. It was within inches. And in September, I was at my sister's house in Eagle Mountain, which is close to where Richard lives. And he had rented a Mustang convertible, And my daughter and one of my son's girlfriends was there, and they did get my kids into that car, and he had kidnapped them for 18 days. Contempt of court, all of these things that the judge kept saying, you got to return the kids, you got to return the kids. And he was never held accountable, never. The only thing that the commissioner said is, I could throw you in jail right now, but that's all that happened. So Richard currently has the children it's a temporary order living with him based on doing a custody evaluation that he has never paid for. So he is basically given the finger to the courts. And now that it's been 7 years, the custody evaluation still isn't done. So that's why he still has custody of the children. During this time, like Kristyn said, I was using alcohol to self-medicate, and I used a lot of alcohol. At one point, I was drinking 2 bottles of whiskey and a 30-pack of beer every day for quite a while. And that led me to a really bad depression. For my birthday on June 4th, Richard wouldn't let me have the kids. And the next day I tried to commit suicide. And luckily it failed. And then 2 days later, I checked myself into a treatment center, and I'm proud to say that I am 1,483 days sober, over 4 years, and not one relapse. And I'm still married to him and still have to deal with him every day. We have that I can call the kids between 8 and 9 every day that he agreed to in mediation. In December, he had 62 counts of contempt of not following his own agreement, and it's still going on. Even last night, I try every day to talk to the kids, and then so I call them, text them, have to text Richard, and then have to send all this stuff to my attorney, because we have binders of just that he's not going to follow the court. I have to say that being able to be here and tell my story is something that I've always just known that I had to do, that Utah is not going to keep turning their eyes away from polygamy and keep good moms like me from having access to my kids. And I will keep fighting for as long as I need to, because Utah needs to be exposed. What goes on in the courtrooms, what I have had to go through, like in my domestic violence trial, I couldn't even show the pictures. Christine Johnson was the judge, and she dismissed 2 counts of the polygamy and let him do a plea in abeyance, and he was sentenced to 12 months parole, and he had 12 months of parole, and he had to take an anger management class, and he got a $400 fine. And that's from breaking my voice box. After he beat me so bad, I couldn't even get out of bed for 3 weeks. The next morning he came over, and I was in bed, and he looked at my chest and he said, I should have done more. I should have hit you harder. And that's really hard. And my kids don't believe that he did that to me. They just said, I don't believe that Dad did that. And during COVID, 2 of my twins tested positive for COVID on the basketball team. And I was working I went to culinary school, and I was working at a restaurant. And during that time, I couldn't be exposed to COVID, or I couldn't work. So it was close to Christmas, and I kept asking him, I need 7 negative COVID tests so I can have them for Christmas break. He wouldn't do the test. And I had to miss my Christmas break with my kids just because he wouldn't cooperate and get the COVID tests. During COVID as well, the kids were missing school, and they pulled them out and did online schooling. Well, my children were working for him. They weren't doing their online schoolwork. So he uses my kids as unemployed labor. My 16-year-old told me last week that he was working 15, 16-hour days. And it's terrible that, and that's how polygamists get money, is that they have a lot of kids and they work them, and they work and they give the money to the fathers, and that's abusive. The thing that hurts me the most is the generational trauma that goes through to the kids. And now I have grandkids. I have 32 grandkids. I've met 4 of my grandchildren, and it's gut-wrenching. I've had kids get married, and I haven't been invited to the weddings. And even on the wedding invitation, it will say parents of the bride, Richard and the concubine, Henderson. And I'm not even acknowledged as their mother on the invitation. But my whole passion and stuff of being here and fighting for is I will not be quiet about Utah and how they abuse women and re-victimize them and keep giving these abusers custody back to the abuser. And the moms don't have any rights. I am begging the judge to have parent time with my kids, and you shouldn't have to do that. And I will fight for the rest of my life so that other moms don't have to go through what I've gone through. It is gut-wrenching and it is hard, but I am a survivor and I will keep surviving. And Jane's going to talk a little bit more about that.
Before she does, I wanted to just throw this in because, and I get emotional with working for so long with victims. And I want to just reiterate, this isn't the only story. There are many, many, many women who've gone through this, and some men. And even sometimes the men are not happy in these plural families. My brother is a really good example, and he's finally writing his book. He's 2 years old. This brother is 2 years older than me. He said he was suicidally depressed. He couldn't make his wives happy. He loved them, but he believed he had to do this. They had 17 kids. They lost a couple. He said every day he wanted to just drive off a cliff because the wives were fighting and depressed and unhappy, and he couldn't make them happy. And he just felt like he was living a big fat lie. So it's not, I just wanted to say, it's not always the women who are the victims too. A lot of men are victimized in these situations as well. He couldn't make ends meet. He just believed with all his heart, because like me, we were told that's what we needed to do to please God and to get to heaven. And he just couldn't do it. So yeah, this is just common. It's just sad. So Jane's turn.
Okay, it's hard to follow that one. So from a criminal perspective, obviously Nicole's detailed a lot of her physical abuse. She was also sadly raped. There was a lot of sexual abuse. And as she's already sort of explained, the state still don't support her, and they're still sort of not penalizing him for not following through on court orders. Things such as rape is actually in the Utah Criminal Code. There's no statute of limitations. There's so many provisions that should be done. There's so many ways that we should be able to prosecute Richard and other people, but it's just not happening. I mean, Nicole's complaint of rape within the marriage was seemingly overlooked, much like the victims in religious cults, specifically offshoots of the mainstream LDS church. And as we know, Utah is commonly known as the Mormon state. I mean, we're not implying that Mormons on the whole are to blame, nor are we accusing them explicitly of turning a blind eye. But I will say that statistics, testimonials, and Nicole's case in particular, doesn't fill anyone with a lot of hope of being heard as a victim. And that kind of relates back to my solid argument earlier regarding comparative studies towards like the UK and Ireland. in that it's victim-led, and there's lots of training and provisions put in place for victims and to protect them. I mean, it's commonly known that the legislators of Utah are LDS leaning, and there's no coincidence that victims of polygamous sex are broken away from the LDS church, is silenced, and they're not listened to. There's no statute of limitations for sexual violence, but again, Utah is not supporting the victims and is providing safe services to disclose and be protected upon and during court. What they should be doing is providing some sort of stability so victims can come forward. They're not harassed, they're not stalked. Scientology is a prime example of the stalking and harassment sort of avenue that they do. But again, there's just no provisions. I don't think anywhere in the US really has a good victim-led sort of provision in place. And the women are just being ignored and they're silenced by cult leaders hiding behind the notion of religion, and therefore the US government cannot or will not, probably will not interfere with this. And as we've seen recently in May this year, Danny Masterson of Scientology was finally found guilty of 2 counts of rape and came very close to a guilty verdict on the 3rd count. This case is most of you will probably know, has been going on for years. And it just kept getting delayed for various reasons, stalling tactics, but finally we got 2 guilty verdicts. Yes, it would have been great to have 3, but he's facing 30 years in jail. And I'm hoping, might be wishful thinking, but my hope is that even though that was in California, that it'll sort of set a precedent to an extent in modern times that nobody's above the law and that hiding behind religion is not tolerated. And it's certainly not as concrete as they thought it was, clearly. Like, it took a long time, but they finally got there. And I'm just so proud of the people who were involved and the victims for really sticking with it, because that was tough. I know we sort of, probably everybody here knows a bit more about Scientology than the average Joe on the street, but I've had people ask me because they know that my interest is there and they don't really get it. And they're like, no, you need to look at the stalking, the harassment, and all of the control and coercive behavior, the money they can put into it. Victims don't have money, they don't have any provisions. I mean, it's similar to like the Me Too movement, that kind of ignited people who had been victims, but they hadn't dared come forward. So when you add the other layer of religious abuse and the toxicity of that and the protection around religion, how can a survivor of a cult come forward when regular people off the street aren't believed? Like, it's just impossible. So it leads me on to a really big critique about the US Constitution. Obviously, as a British person, I don't necessarily view it the same as Americans. But I suppose the ideology of the Constitution was based on a secular society after many looked at Europe as heavily reliant on religious values. The US was seen and known as the free new world away from the Eurocentric values, though some would argue that the US was founded by a puritanical cult. That was a conversation we had earlier. I took it on board. The seemingly progressive new nation was seen as revolutionary and awe-inspiring to those who wanted to live in a secular society. However, equality was not a core aspect of the Constitution, nor was it a basic condition of Republican governments. Hereditary aristocracy and slavery are prime examples of the injustice towards equality. While the US rejected inherited status and banned titles of nobility, they casually accepted the idea of natural aristocracy based on merit. The First Amendment is frequently used in modern society to protect rights of individuals. I think for just about everything at the minute, everyone is going, oh, it's my First Amendment right. Right, it's not. The First Amendment underpinned the wall of separation between church and state. The belief that God created human beings to have personal freedom of mind and conscience was the cornerstone of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which was written by Thomas Jefferson in 1779 and secured into state law by James Madison in 1786. It's a small paragraph, but I'm going to read it. So it reads, no man shall be compelled to frequent or support any religious worship, place of ministry whatsoever, nor shall be enforced, restrained, molested, or burthened by his body or goods. No shall otherwise suffer an account of his religious opinions or belief, but that all men shall be free to profess and by argument to maintain their opinion in matters of religion, and the same shall be in no wise diminish, enlarge, or affect their civil capacities. We know that cults breach every word and sentiment of this statement. Steve Eichel's checklist of characteristics combined with Steve Hassan's bite model underpin the lack of the First Amendment being afforded to individuals who are all too consumed by their cult and its leader. People have severe lack of autonomy, and especially women in cults, and in particular women who've fallen into polygamous groups or even born into them. These two prime examples right here. The lack of autonomy contravenes everything that the US Constitution claims to believe in. And right now we're living in a severe change in society where women and other people of specific community groups are having their fundamental freedoms and rights stripped from them. In a time where politics globally is going through some extreme changes, women are suffering more and more. We discuss in mainstream media about how women are affected by such happenings like Roe v. Wade. We are outraged by that, how women have a lack of autonomy and rights, yet women in cults have suffered this for generations, and it's just getting worse. Control of women's rights and bodies have been integral in everyday politics. And with the Roe v. Wade thing, and I know it's controversial because I don't know how people sitting in this room, and many will agree with the overturn and disagree with my opinion on this. But as someone who grew up in a country where abortion is free, it's legal, I understand why and how anyone, especially, I struggle to understand why and how anyone, especially a man, can interfere and take away that choice for women. Moreover, they have this inherent desire for right to life, yet when an unwanted child is born, there is no social welfare to assist new mothers in raising the child. If there was, Nicole would have been able to leave and take her children. The hypocrisy in this is absolutely deafening. I mean, as these two have just demonstrated, especially Kristyn, having been born into it for so many generations, they've had to suffer from the hands of men for most, if not all, of their entire lives. And what I found in my research was really quite interesting, I suppose. It was like in the 1800s, in 1862, the Moral Anti-Bigamy Act was in law, and by 1878, Reynolds v. the US, the Supreme Court held that religious duty was not a defense in a criminal indictment. So this was the first case to really test the First Amendment's protection of religious liberties. But it would seem that there was more protection for Nicole back in the 1800s than there is today. That is just crazy for me to hear, especially coming from England that is, it's not great right now, but it's generally a lot freer. I actually left England recently because of Brexit, so that's a whole other problem. But there's a lot of freedom, like there's a lot of choice that you can make, and these guys haven't had those choices. And it's just mind-boggling that how the 1800s, which was meant to be like so long ago, and we're meant to be so progressive and everything else, Nicole would have had far more protection. And I just find it really mind-blowing that she's having to fight every single day just for like the basic freedom. I mean, there's no known legal routes to leave polygamy, as she's explained. There's no supports waiting for you. When you liken that to sort of domestic abuse, violence, there's some provisions for people to leave. But again, we're back to social welfare. There's no handout, and there's no real substantial handouts from the state to build your life back. Again, in England and in Ireland, they do a lot of social welfare. So my job actually is with the migrant community in Ireland. So when people come through the international protection system, they get so much from the government and so on and so forth. So I've seen the sort of journey that they go through. And it's similar, obviously they're not from cults, but it's similar in terms of they're rebuilding their lives in a new place, completely far away from home. The similarities are there, and like they fight and they work, and they're given a helping hand to get back on their feet, start working. A lot of them are like doctors, and they've fled like Afghanistan, Iraq, or wherever, or Eritrea. I had someone from the other day. They just need a helping hand. But it's the same for Nicole. She needs a helping hand. She needed to come out of the cult and have a support system there, not to live on forever, but to get herself going. And she hasn't had any of that. And one of our sort of bugbears in a way was, there's a lot of organizations like nonprofits in Utah that do a lot of good, but there's also a lot that kind of, I won't say they do harm, but they're inherently religious. And when someone's come from a cult or a high intense religious environment, the last thing they want is to be preached at by God. They need the space. They need to be agnostic or atheist or whatever it needs. They don't need the pressures. And we were particularly frustrated around, I suppose, how would you call it? Just like the religious interference, I suppose, for groups that are meant to help you leave. But again, they're reliant on donations and stuff. The state's still not helping them. The state really needs to be there to protect women, children, or even men in some cases. We need to be able to rebuild lives. And until that happens, people are never going to be able to leave cults properly or financially stable or be able to rebuild their life. Nicole's basically in a permanent state of trauma. She's done so well, but it's been incredibly difficult for her to get to a point where, you know, you can be self-sufficient and have your children. Because I do feel like if you had the money and the house and everything else, that the judge would maybe sway a little bit more. But how on earth are you meant to get to that point without help? Like, it's just near on impossible. As Kristyn said, she came from the cult, from being born into it. She had to re-educate herself. Like, Nicole's children, one by one, they're aging out of childhood into adulthood, and she can no longer save them. We're down to 4. And it was her hope and dreams as a mother to have custody of children, take them away from the concubine and the toxic husband, so they can have the empowerment to choose religion or abstain. But right now they have no choice. She has no choice. And so many women in these sects just really have no choice. But I suppose politically, when you look at the demographic across America, Florida in particular at the minute, women generally have no choice. So when you add that into like the religious abuse, it's further exacerbated, I would say, and it makes it a lot harder than the normal person.
One more thing that I feel is really important to talk about is the most recent decisions in Utah. So in 2019, I believe it was, that we were at the Capitol and working toward keeping polygamy illegal, or at least a crime. And then we talked about the options to not throw everybody in jail, but nobody wants to listen. I mean, we just were peons and nobody. We can do it this way and we can do it that way, where we can still honor the children and the women and not steal their kids away, the believers, but this is what we can do. And we helped to win a case where Nicole would have gotten, and still can, we're checking into that, but some reparations funds. But they want to just call that nothing to do with polygamy. We had it set so that anyone who wanted to leave plural marriage could go, and they had passed this in the legislative, and the senators passed this. So back when I wanted to go and had nothing, I could have said, I'm out of here, please help me. It was a refugee program. And they could have done that, help me with housing, with my kids, with the things that were necessary. And the very next year, those that were at the Capitol were pro-polygamous people. And there were hundreds, like I said, there were only a few of us, hundreds who wanted it decriminalized and or basically put on the shelf as, so they passed the law in Utah that it would be like you said, $750 fine if there's crimes, if the crimes, are committed. Well, nobody's doing anything but. So I called HOH, I called the others, and I asked what their stats are. HOH, who I trust the most from my experience with victims, said that there were no police files of harms that from the people that they'd helped. They had to encourage them to do that. They had to go with them. There was nothing. Oh, I want to back up real quick. The reason they passed this was because the fundamentalists would say, and I get this too. I was raised with this, that if you talk, they're going to throw us all in jail because we're polygamists. They're going to take all of our kids away. They're going to do this. Well, I'm proof, and so is my family and their family and their family, that that never happened. And that it wasn't going to happen in Utah because they wouldn't do anything about anything anyway. And that was obvious. But what did happen is every time, and my dad is a leader and my Uncle Rulon is the leader, every time they won any case that they won, God is on our side. See, we have more power, more of this. So what happened is that the leaders, when they passed this new, basically, what do they call that? It's just an infraction. That's what it's called. Polygamy is now an infraction. So I watched, especially in one particular group, I can say because they're in the media, the Kingston group, where the men who were in charge of that just took more and more and more prerogative toward their women and children. Hey, now there's nothing you can do about it, nothing at all. And I've seen that again and again. The other three, one of them claim, which is pro-polygamy, that they have reports all the time of crimes. The other ones say they don't either, that they haven't had that. So there's no stats. I've asked them to provide those, the government, the AG's office. Have you got more reports? Is this really factual? Did changing this law give victims of polygamy more control or help, or did it harm them even more by the oppressive that was already there from the leaders and husbands and other people? So I've talked enough. Okay, yeah, any questions?